The vast majority, 88%, 9 out of 10 CEOs said we've got to get closer to the customer. Strategy C. They said we will use the customer to drive our change. We will listen to the customer, and basically what the customer needs will be where our strategy needs to get anchored. Makes a lot of sense. And this is also what our data told us. 9 out of 10 CEOs, 88%, said get closer to the customer. That's a great strategy. 8 out of 10, 81%. Now this was shocking. 8 out of 10 said people skills. Wow, of all the things in the world, they said people skills. Why did they say people skills? Because at a consequential level, what they were experiencing, at a symptomatic level, what they were experiencing, was a world where the employee has changed, but management hasn't. We continue to manage a 21st century employee using 20th century management mindsets. And if we don't improve this, our ability to find, keep capability, talent, and get the best people to join us, stay with us, and grow with us is under severe threat. And then the third thing they spoke about was insight and intelligence. So we are in the age of big data. We're in an age where we have more information than we've ever had before. But information is useless unless you can convert it into insight. Right? Information is useless unless it adds to your intelligence and it teaches you how to sort of maneuver this increasingly complex world. So 3 out of 4, 76% said we need to create greater insight. Now, as a researcher, as a strategist, as a writer, I wrote Talent Economics to exactly these 2 points. This is what I was trying to do. We need to start changing employment itself. The employee has evolved. It's high time the employment template evolved and kept pace. The entire employment equation needs to change. Right? And on the other hand, how do we create insight? This last point, this insight and intelligence point, is a great invitation to functions like HR, functions like marketing, functions like finance. Where CEOs are saying, bring greater insight to the strategy table, bring new viewpoints, bring greater analysis, so we can all make better decisions. We need greater insight. And Talent Economics talks to exactly this. What we're trying to do is create greater insight into the global talent system. There are 3 billion people who get up every morning looking to pursue an economic endeavor across this planet. 3 billion people. That number will go to 3.6 billion by 2020. But hidden within this shift are some dramatic messages and some dramatic trends. Do we know all of them? Or are we going to wait till they start playing out on us and then react when it's too late? That's the journey we want to travel. Think of all the Robin Hood movies. You have feudal castles run by feudal lords, and you have a lot of lawlessness in between them, jungles and jungles of crime, lots of disease. So the plague, and a bunch of other things. Europe's average life expectancy across Europe in the Dark Ages was a princely 27. If you lived till 28, you had outlived the population. Think about it. This was the early 1400s, okay? The Dark Ages, Europe's darkest hour. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, at one place, at one time, we have mankind's greatest period of artistic achievement suddenly get born. And we have the birth in Florence in 1406 of the Italian Renaissance. Right? Some of the greatest artists who have ever lived suddenly congregating at one place, at one time, approximately in the same generation, and creating great masterpieces that even today define the pinnacle of their art form. So Da Vinci, Raphael, Michelangelo, Brunelleschi, Galileo, Machiavelli, some of the greatest thinkers, astronomers, scientists, writers, leadership. The first book, The Prince by Machiavelli, was written around that time. Leadership thinkers, all of them congregate in Florence and create these great masterpieces. And then in the early 1600s, 200 years later, early 1600s, the Italian Renaissance tapers off and dies. And Europe goes back to the Dark Ages. Now historians and management thinkers have tried to figure out why this happened. How did this suddenly come about and where did it go? And what really led to this? What are those circumstances that gave us, this period of great. And think about it, this was a time when art was repressed by religion. The church said what you could and couldn't do, what you could and couldn't say, what you could and couldn't create. And suddenly you had these great, thinkers come and do this. Now, when you study the Italian Renaissance, and what these management thinkers and historians have found is that the entire episode can be put down to the efforts of one family, and that family is the Medici. Now, the Medici were Europe's richest family at that time. They owned the Medici Bank. And one of the early Medicis, Giovanni de' Medici, that gentleman there on top, became a patron of the arts. He was a very powerful man, very rich man. And what he said was he invited thinkers who were at the pinnacle of their discipline across Europe to say, come to Florence, and I will give you unlimited Medici patronage, unlimited resources, unlimited time, political cover, and I want you to do things which are at the edge of your skills, and then move beyond those edges and create things that you've never created before, and create great masterpieces. So the Medici put this invitation out there, and they attracted talent from all across Europe. And then Giovanni was survived by his grandson, Cosimo, and Cosimo's great-grandson, Lorenzo, and what they did over 200 years was keep this patronage alive. And you had the Italian Renaissance. But what even the Medici didn't bargain for, there was something that happened, magical, that even the Medici hadn't planned for. And that was, by bringing all these great thinkers from different disciplines together, they allowed disciplines to learn from one another. So, the sculptors taught the painters how to paint in 3 dimensions, and the Mona Lisa was born. And the painters taught the architects how they could decorate their great architectural monuments through frescoes and all sorts of fantastic paint, and they persist till today as some of the greatest examples of art form in architecture. And then the architects taught the sculptors how to create greater form in sculpting, in their great statues. And sculpting moved forward. So since then, when we allow 2 disciplines to come together and learn from one another, this phenomena is called the Medici effect. When you allow 2 seemingly unrelated viewpoints to converge and innovate both, their views of the world, of what we can do with individual bodies of knowledge, we create a Medici effect. What we're trying to do through talent economics is bring economics and talent management together. Now, how many have studied economics in school or college? How many here have studied economics in some form? Fantastic. I studied too. And think back at your first lecture with your first professor, your first textbook in economics, and there's an introduction chapter, and that introduction chapter, gave you the definition of economics. Can you remember it? In its simplest form, in that one sentence, what is economics? Okay, fantastic. Economics is nothing but the behavioral science that studies how the forces of demand and supply allocate scarce resources. In its basal form, this is what economics is. How market mechanisms set price, which then distributes scarce resources based on forces of demand and supply. That's what economics is. What is, according to most CEOs, the scarcest resource in organizations today? There you are. And still no one has bothered to bring this together till now. And it is important. It's important that we use constructs which have existed for centuries to study what we believe is one of the most critical resources on planet Earth today: capability, talent, because it is fueling all our ambitions. So in talent economics, we study the global labor pool from 2 perspectives. We look for macro trends, and the macro trends essentially play out across an aggregate talent system. We're looking for trends in demand and supply, imbalances, shifts in demand and supply, and how they will impact business. When you study aggregate talent, you're essentially creating a macro view. And then in microeconomics, micro-talent economics, we study the individual and how the individual is changing, right? And if the 21st century employee that turns up for work today is more aware, more assertive, more empowered, and looking for different things, how must the way we as organizations, we as industry manage that talent change? So as the employee evolves, how must employment evolve to keep pace? That's what micro-talent economics tries to do. And we try and put these viewpoints together so we can look at our most critical resource and create greater insight for business. And more importantly, get ready for the world in 2020. That's what we're going to do. So do you want to play with some data? You want to look at some of the findings? At this stage, it's a good point to sort of dive in a little bit and get our hands a little dirty. So I want to start with a very, very high-level view. Now, these are the 7 global macro trends playing out across the world. These 7 are prevalent across all industries. They're prevalent across different parts of all 5 economic geographies across the world. You'll find them on every continent in some shape or form. And these are the 7, as strategists, as talent managers, as thinkers, we need to be ready for, we need to have an opinion on, and we need to have studied within our economic system. Does it impact us or not? And if it does, how are we responding? These are the 7 global macro trends as we stand today in 2010. So the first is, let's start from the west and move eastward. Okay? The first is the shortage of qualified graduates. Now, this is most acutely felt in Silicon Valley in the United States, where technology has moved so fast that they cannot find graduates with the right kind of software skills for new technologies that are sort of emerging in the Web 2.0 and beyond space. And they're finding that the millions and millions of coding jobs are going vacant or have to be outsourced because they just don't have capability in what is the hottest software market in the world. But you see this across multiple industries, don't you? And we had some evidence earlier too. You've got educational proficiency. So in many emerging markets and developed markets across the world, you have very ambitious talent, very, very aspirational talent that wants to do things with their career. But the reality is, unless they get the basic education that is required for them to translate that ambition into an effective career, that talent is log-jammed. The reality is, if you don't know science by the age of 15, you're never going to become an engineer. You're never going to become a scientist. You're never going to become a researcher. If the quality of your foundational scientific study isn't up to scratch, the economic system as a whole will have a dearth of potential at higher education and at industry levels. So if educational proficiency fails us, it's damaging the entire macro talent pipeline within an economic system. You've got workforce participation rates which are abnormally low across the Middle East, but in many markets across the world, you find a big chunk of the workforce doesn't participate economically, in industry. And that creates demand-supply imbalances. You've got aging workforces, predominantly felt across Europe, but many markets in East Asia too, and in other parts of the world, where industry is looking for young talent, but they find the demographic mix of their workforce changing. Then you've got the capital of unwanted turnover, wonderful India, incredible India, where we have turnover rates in some industries now hitting 50%. And talent is just, walking out. It's a revolving door, which we keep reading about and hearing about. And organizations don't know how to stem this hemorrhage. Right? There are very few answers out there that are working. And then in China, you have a couple of trends which are anchored. The first is wage inflation in many hot industries. It's galloping out of control. And the second is shortage of experience, where industry has grown faster than capability could grow. In China, for example, where private enterprise has sort of blossomed in the last 20 years, you find a massive shortage of middle managers, senior managers, because the circumstances for them to learn business 20 years ago just didn't exist when they started their careers. And now we expect them to be senior managers with 45, 50-year-old age profiles and experience profiles, but they didn't have the trajectory that is required in order to build those capabilities in market systems like China. India has been more fortunate. We've had a much more stable economic transition. It's been slower, but it's been a blessing in some ways that we've still had jobs for a lot of people when they started their career, and those people are now, have followed an economic growth trajectory, a learning trajectory, which makes them capable of doing more senior jobs. But China is struggling. Okay,